Hey, welcome back to the What the Tech podcast, where we explore the mind-boggling world of technology. Now, in today's episode, we're actually going to be taking a deep dive into the life and thinking of Sam Altman, who is an enigmatic figure whose contributions to technology and AI have really been revolutionary, to say the very least. His insights, ideologies, and the sheer power of his vision have dramatically reshaped the landscape of artificial intelligence. So fasten your seatbelts as we navigate the twists and turns of Altman's exciting journey from his work at Combinator to his pivotal role at OpenAI. Let's go. Hey, today the pleasure is mine to welcome back my co-host, Stephen Faust, who actually will be in the hot seat this time. Now, always known for his delightful humor and insightful perspectives on technology, Steve's dynamic presence has always been a crowd favorite. So brace yourselves for a riveting discussion filled with chuckles and wisdom as we dive into the world of Sam Altman, with Stephen helping me decode this interesting topic. Hey, Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
We always have so much fun today or on our chats that, I almost don't even care that anybody's listening, to be honest with you, because if it's not fun for them, it being fun or interesting to our listeners is really a byproduct of the conversations I always enjoy having with you. So I'm glad you always make time for me.
Yeah, sure. No, it's fun for me too.
Not to mention, I bought some really crappy shirts. And my man Steve was like, he was wearing it. I didn't know how bad they were because they weren't cheap per se. I was like, these should be nice as much as I'm spending on them. And then Steve was like, hey, man, I know a guy. And so he hooked us up with these awesome shirts. So if you like the shirts, I'm going to say, hey, comment in the below in the comments. Give us a like or something. Because it's not for me, it's for my man Steve and his resourcing skills. So thank you, Steve.
Yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, it sounds like I'm in the mob or something. I know a guy.
I know a guy. You don't look like you could be in the mob. You're too pale for that.
Pretty much, yeah.
So let's kick off today's deep dive with a fun question. Now, we're talking about Sam Altman, right? And so if you could have coffee with Sam, what would be the one burning question you'd have for him?
That's good. Well, I almost feel like it's a byproduct of some of the interviews I've seen where there's a lot of elements he can't talk about. Mostly when he got wrapped around the axle with the board, right? There's a lot of internal things for legal reasons he can't speak of. So I feel like anytime you're deprived information, you instantly crave it. You're like, you tell the kids, don't look in that room, and then that's all they can think about is what's in that freaking room. So I feel like that's just because he won't share it. I almost feel like that would be my subject matter, is be like, tell me the things you can't share. Now, I guess if we're going to go down the rabbit hole of, okay, let's say he still can't share it with you, what else would I ask him? I guess I just as someone outside of his bubble, I would say, look, what do you feel like just the average person could do to, be more than just an observer of this AI journey, Because, I think that's one of the things we're going to bring up today in the conversation. But, I feel like there's a lot of pull back and forth, a contrast of, should it be open source or not open source? Or if it's not open source, basically, how can people contribute? Because, I see the justifications for both sides of the argument. But at the same time, I like the idea that AI is advancing, but I want it to be responsible. But how would I contribute to its evolution, right? Again, just being a user. I'd love it nothing more if, ChatGPT came back and I was like, that's pretty good, but there's something it could make better, and I just submit something. I'm not changing the source, but I at least am able to lift it up or build it, right? I think that's just getting an understanding from him, hey, what are ways I can help contribute just as an outsider that, wants to be part of the cause, right? Because I think, growing artificial intelligence responsibly, I think it's a good thing. It's going to benefit everyone. I think it's, a lot of people make it out to be the devil, but I think it's like any other tool. It can be used responsibly or irresponsibly. And yeah, I think that would be my kind of big question is how can the average person, kind of help prop up and advance this technology responsibly.
Yeah, and it's more than just being able to connect to the technology and allow whatever software or platform you have to be more robust with its research, capabilities and things like that. It's really, steering the direction of like how the platform thinks, the amount of input that it has, that it doesn't have a huge bias, things like that. That's kind of what you're hinting at, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think again, I mean, I think there's contributing from a like code level, and then there's also contributing from a, hey, how is it being used, or red flagging things or whatever, like from a security standpoint, anything like that. Yeah, for sure.
Right. Yeah. Well, before we kick off the rest of the show, because I have a lot of questions for Steve, who's been researching Sam like crazy. But I want to kick things off with just kind of a quick narrative about Sam and who he is for those of you that have not really researched either his work before OpenAI, and maybe some of the drama, kind of around who is Sam Altman. So I'm going to share a little bit of that, and then we'll kick it off with some questions and some dialogue. We'll see where this takes us. Sound good, Steve?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So Steve Altman, he's really an enigma of a figure in the technology industry, and he actually often finds himself at the heart of discourse. He's from St. Louis, and he was a Stanford dropout. Altman's impressive technology trajectory actually launched him into the limelight at a very early age. He's only 38 now, and where he actually co-founded Looped, a location-based social networking mobile app, which actually went on to be acquired by Green Dot Corporation for over $43 million. So getting started pretty quickly and pretty effectually. But arguably his tenure at Combinator, actually one of the most prestigious startup accelerators in the world, and his current role as the CEO of OpenAI that have cemented him as really a force in the tech world. Now, Altman is actually known for his insights, and often being controversial in what he says in the public. As he once stated, the hard part about figuring out what you want to do with your career is to be a doer, not a talker. So just saying that, in the industry of technology is probably going to earn you maybe a few enemies, primarily because they're probably targeted to somebody in his past or in his general sphere, right? And not only that, take the risk of committing to what you have a conviction on. This is, in many ways, encapsulates his approach to life, but also invites us to question the depth and sincerity of his intentions. Now, he studied computer science at Stanford, but left 2 years shy of graduating to pursue his entrepreneurial ambitions. And his education, or rather his decision to forego it, becomes kind of a narrative around itself, per se. And it really breeds a certain bit of suspicion for some people. Now, I personally don't have a problem with it. I think that, for a lot of people, they learn differently. And sometimes, at the speed and pace of, universities or some of the other things that maybe aren't necessarily as focused on the narrow, and important things that might be on your trajectory, you could see why maybe somebody like a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs or, even Sam Altman would kind of deviate from that a little bit to kind of get to the finish line a little bit quicker. But, many people believe that this might be an indicator that he has a slight disregard for conventional pathways. Now, Altman's influences actually range from Elon Musk to Peter Thiel, both of whom are really geniuses that we're all pretty familiar with. And have obviously their fair share of critics for other things. Everybody believes Elon Musk is brilliant, but a lot of times they question some of the other things he does outside of either SpaceX or Tesla or other things, like the whole Twitter thing, right? But he not only admires these people, but he actually closely worked with them, leading to question the extent of their influence actually in ideologies that were actually within the OpenAI platform, knowing that they've invested time and money into this platform. Now, his critics often point out his aggressive pursuit of AI. We were talking about this before the show, Steve, about how there was a lot of tension at the top of the organization with the board members and things like that. And so there's a little bit of controversy there that we'll be talking a little bit about more later in the show. But with some actually fearing that he's potentially misusing some of this advanced technology and then playing both sides against the middle a little bit to try to get what he wants. And for the most part, he's been celebrated for his acumen and equally kind of questioned for his relentless drive towards the future dominated by AI, which kind of for some people, and when you've talked about this a little bit before, Steve, is a little bit scary, right? And for some people, they're full tilt. And I think there's some answer in the middle, because I do think this technology is going to happen anyways. And, as believers, you and I can kind of come alongside and try to help steer that towards, moral and ethical ways to use it. But if there's nobody in there kind of trying to play, referee with the right and the wrong side of this, then I think, if there's one voice pushing for that, that could be a scary thing for a lot of people. Now, his long-term vision, while undeniably ambitious, is debated in various technology circles for its potential implications, and we're already seeing some of that. How just certain industries are changing, completely. Anything in the written word is changing completely. The narrative is oftentimes being written by AI. So there's a little bit of fear for some of the delusional, type hallucinations that AI has and things like that, as well as the bias that is likely within the platform based on input, right? Either way, Altman's journey, though fascinating, is not without its question marks. As we delve deeper into his life and ideologies, one begins to really wonder, is Sam Altman a visionary leading us towards a technologically advanced future, or is he a radical pushing the boundaries a little bit too far? This is the question that we're going to be exploring today. And so I'm excited to kind of open up the questioning to Steve. So, Steve, first of all, I'd like you to share some thoughts on Sam Altman's decision to kind of drop out of Stanford. Is this a good decision in your mind? Is it one that is kind of typical in the tech industry? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, you listed some examples of entrepreneurs that dropped out and became successful. Other ones that throw on there are like Michael Dell, who I know closely because where I'm based, and also I've met him when I was at UT. They always had a little tongue-in-cheek when they announced him. Like they always say something like "former student" or whatever they allude to, that are like they're not sure how to represent that because they don't want to be like, yes, be like Michael Dell, but don't leave UT. Like you finished the whole thing. I was looking up other successful dropouts. Henry Ford apparently was a dropout. I'm like, dang, that's kicking it old school, right? But I think, is it typical of? Most of the examples, minus Henry Ford there, Zuckerberg is another one, were tech guys. But I'm clearly dropping out of college is not exclusive for tech guys. But I would say, I don't know. I think even the term dropout, I feel like has this really negative stigma, right? Versus, I almost think anything else you were doing, if you then switched to doing something else, wouldn't have a negative connotation. Like, if he was working at a trade school and didn't finish because he found something else he liked, I don't even know if you'd say dropped out of trade school. Maybe you would. But, like, I don't know. Let's say you were just, like, apprenticing for someone or, like working on a project, I don't know, you're volunteering overseas for Habitat Humanity, and then you decided to do something else. Like, people transition all the time for different reasons. And, sometimes they're successful, or sometimes maybe they should have stayed what they were doing. It's easy to look back on it and be like, yeah, that was definitely the smart move. So I think
for the most part, though, if we're telling somebody's story, Steve, it's probably not because they're a huge failure. They're like, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So like a lot of the decisions that they made were probably the right ones for them. Otherwise they wouldn't be where they're at. But I do agree, like if you drop out of trade school, nobody's really talking about that unless you're a big success, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. I don't know. I feel like the problem is that people have come to think of, go to a good school, finish the good school, and then it's just like it equals success, right? And I'm not saying that can't happen, but that also isn't a guarantee of anything, right? And another thing I think that makes it maybe even a higher percentage with these people that are in the tech industry is the universities don't move at a quick rate in terms of their education. And for a lot of curriculum, that's fine, right? History, perfect example. Like it happened a while back. The university doesn't have to catch up with history, right? Like it happened, they're disseminating. The fine arts, like we're teaching someone to play an instrument. They have a ton of curriculum. If they're not the cutting edge of, French horn, like who cares? It's not a big deal. With technology, it is a big deal. That's where the disconnect, enter the disconnect. And I remember when I was at UT, back in my day, I remember professors were making bank. How are they making bank? They weren't making much money from the university, but they would learn a new hot language like Cold Fusion, Java, whatever. They weren't teaching those languages because their curriculum wasn't able to catch up because of all the red tape, bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it. So They would rent a lecture hall at UT, which is huge. They would sell tickets, $100 for this 3-hour lecture on Cold Fusion, and they would kill, right? And the university would let them use the lecture hall for free, and they would make $300, $400. I mean, these tickets would just go, and it was open to everybody, not just students. Anybody could pay money, go in that lecture hall, and he would talk for 3 hours on Cold Fusion. And they were killing it. But that just goes to show you how disconnected they were. Like, they should have been teaching the students that language. Why weren't they? Well, all the reasons I just talked about. Because it takes them forever to get approved on a subject, to get a textbook, to get lab resources. So they were always lagging behind. Now, again, I'm not saying there's no value in learning computer science at a university because it teaches you fundamentals like variables, like things like loops. Like those can translate to any type of code. But I feel after a point, let's say 2 years, you've kind of got that concept down, right? And then after that, they're just shoveling on whatever else they can. Like, oh, you need to take 4 more fine arts credits and intramural basketball. And he was probably like, nope, like, I don't need that. And again, like, why do they do that? Well, it's like it's the same reason that universities have 4 years instead of if you took every single CS course at that university, you could squeeze it into 2 years easily. But it's like, oh, this whole umbrella of well-rounded individual. They have to take languages. Why? Why is that, right? Like, because the university's setting the rules, and they also don't want to. If they made all this other stuff optional, like nobody would take these courses. I should say nobody, a small percentage. So it's like they're doing it for their own benefit. They don't ever want to admit that, but that's really what's happening. And I could definitely see the appeal where you're like, look, I went here, I got educated, I received the benefits of this education. It got me to a certain point. Now I'm going on a different trajectory. I think that, he did the pro and con in his head and it was like all pro leaving, So, I think, again, someone that was majoring in, I don't know, who knows, moss studies at the, biology department. Like they knew that they better get that freaking degree because, understanding more about moss in the real world doesn't get you that far. Now you could teach on it, maybe. Right. You could maybe do some research, but that's the whole thing. The moment your career is tied to academia, then of course you got to finish the degree. But again, nobody's telling Sam Altman he can't have a job because he didn't finish his Stanford degree. Like, no. And I feel more and more the tech industry is kind of like that. I rarely see people question, did someone finish? It's more about what do you know? What can you do for me? That kind of thing.
No, I do think that there are certain industries that are more appealing for somebody who is not going to run the 4 to 6 year, gambit that is the university system. But you're right. There are many, careers that if you don't have it, you can't get in, right? And so I understand. I certainly want my doctors. And look, modern medicine is changing, but it hasn't changed so much that you're going to go through the university, who is a lot of times a research hospital is connected to it or whatever. That they're going to be getting the right type of education around whatever field of medicine that they're going into. So there are still plenty of good examples where academia is doing things right. But I think in the tech world, it would be hard for you to be cutting edge if that's what you're trying to be in the tech world with just the speed of change, right? If you've printed a textbook on it, it's probably late to the game. Let's be honest.
A whole cottage industry. If you remember ITC Tech, which, I mean, I don't even know if they're still around, but that whole cottage industry came out the fact that these universities couldn't keep up. Like ITC Tech, you could get these, you could call them made up concepts, but you could get a degree in computer networks. You could get a degree in security. Again, the universities still don't have that, right? You cannot major in IT security, at least not that I know of, right? They don't, like the closest thing is like maybe CS, right? Again, and a ton of what I got certified on when I left the school, you couldn't learn there, like none of it. I mean, take the whole OSI stack. How much of that would the university teach you? I'd say maybe 10%. And I don't care what you majored in. They weren't covering it. And,
Right.
Again, it's very much like they can't move at that pace, right? Is unfortunate, right?
So I'm curious, for you, how do you perceive Altman's kind of worldview? Kind of where he went to school, kind of where he grew up. How do all of those, things kind of play into, his mindset and the way that he's kind of doing things today?
Yeah, he's got an interesting background. I mean, when I was researching him, he's a self-described Midwestern Jew that happens to now live in the heart of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, right? So more of moving towards progressive elements. But I feel like some of that has shaped him. Obviously, kind of that upbringing, which I feel like helps him. Like I feel like we've talked about before, be a little bit more grounded because of kind of his background, where he came from. I also think when you look at his background, especially the success he had early, I think it shapes your trajectory in terms of just like, I'm just trying to make money versus now, I could focus on things like he was doing with some of his other ventures where like I'm controlling venture capital, but I'm trying to build up companies and I can be philanthropic. I definitely feel like that now shapes when you're not just driven by money. Now he does talk about there's elements of ChatGPT that they have to have a for-profit to fund these really expensive models that they have to use supercomputers for. But I think he's trying to ride that balance. I mean, I think that also influences his worldview. Is like I hear him constantly say that capitalism has a ton of flaws, but it's still the best system we've come up with. Is kind of the way he characterizes it. So it's like he's trying to put together all these concepts of, I want this to be a great tool for humanity, but we also need to somehow make money. I mean, I think so. He's trying to kind of work in those elements. And I think like most CEOs, he can, I would say, if you're like, what are some top characteristics of, business leaders, at that level, is that they can see just a little further out down the road than anybody else. And that's what makes them successful, right? Because it's like somebody saying, I'm going to get out of real estate right when it was before it tanked, right? Like they can see just a little further down the road of where things are heading and get out ahead of it, right? And that's equal success, right? They can say, oh,
Right.
this is where the market's going, or this is where this trend is going. And I think that kind of, I feel like, is part of what's, kind of influences worldview, so to speak.
Nice. So, his impact, specifically around AI, like, I'm curious, do you feel like he was the one that was really just more funded? Or, do you feel like he had an edge in this arena and, kind of helping to bring this mainstream? I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a reason that, ChatGPT hit all these crazy benchmarks, like it hit 1 million users in the shortest amount of time for any application, and it hit 100 million shortest amount of time. Like that happens because it's different, right? Because again, I don't think anybody's going to say there wasn't some version of AI through a chat interface before ChatGPT. No, it was not the first, but it was the one that caught on, right? I mean, heck, look at Facebook. I mean, because remember we had MySpace, right? It's like nobody knows what the heck that is anymore, but MySpace definitely beat Facebook, right? And if you sat down and looked at them as the average consumer, like what's the difference, right? There were subtleties, and you would think, oh, not that. Like if you're an investor, and I said pick one, you might not have picked Facebook, right? Because they were. But I feel like that's the whole thing, is that those subtle differences seem subtle, but they actually, when you really zoom in, were like a chasm, and that's what pushed them over the top. Is when people really started seeing the potential. They really started taking it seriously. Then I feel like they're peeling back that onion and seeing how big a deal this was. And then it's just like, well, we can apply it to this. We can apply it to that. And then it's just like snowballed All right, yes, so I feel like they had a very unique element. I mean, I think that people have been calling him freaking Prometheus for bringing fire from the gods. Like, it was so unique. It was something that had never existed before.
Right.
And I think that's why it took off. Hence the million users within whatever short period of time, and so on and so forth.
I think it's interesting that they correlated Prometheus with OpenAI, or you could even go Skynet if you wanted to, right? Like a lot of people have called Google Skynet, because they really have their eyeballs on everything. But this really has its eyes. I mean, OpenAI is really touching everything now. Like, if it's on the internet, because before it was really what information was fed to the system, and now it's got full access to the internet to pull in information, real-time information, and that really changes what it is and what it can do, right? As far as current world issues, you can ask it to go look at a website and summarize something. You can ask it to research particular things, bring back all the research, and then create whatever narrative you really want, which is interesting. So I guess the controversy around maybe Altman's view on how AI should be used in everyday life. I'm curious to get your ideas, your perspective on potentially any ethical implications of him wanting it everywhere all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at their mission statement, or at least one I saw him talk about recently, is the second half of it is to be used securely, right? Because I feel like he understands it's a real threat. And he also understands that's part of the reason people are hesitant to adopt it and allow it to scale, is they're like, hey, look, you're opening Pandora's box here and you've got no guardrails, right? So they've literally built it into their charter. Now, like, how do you do that securely and safely? I mean, he would say that's part of the reason it's not as open as it is, right? Because there's a lot of people saying, hey, you're open, AI is your name of your company, but you're not open. And part of it, he would say, is, hey, we're trying to protect people, like, to not let it be misused. We don't want this code base to get sucked into some evil machine and then used, in a negative way. But I think he also realizes that even the existence of this technology is lending itself towards that. Now, how can he control it? How can he watch out for it? I mean, I think when I saw him even handle this question in an interview, he talked more about, okay, people are going to trust relationships. They're going to trust certain sources. I think that's a big area of it as well. I think if OpenAI is telling you something that you feel is a little questionable, you're going to talk to actual humans, right? Or at least some source you think is important, like a human, but like you're not going to talk to them. You're going to see, okay, look, like these trusted figures are saying this, and more than one too, right? Because I feel like everybody's valuable. But I think if people you talk to and trust, and then people that are large figures, I'm not even just saying political, but just other figures are saying a different thing than the AI. I think you can compare and contrast the two. I think that's one element of it. I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where, like, if every single person is telling you, don't jump off a cliff or whatever, and the OpenAI is like, definitely jump off a cliff. I think, you can kind of mitigate those two factors. But I do feel like the threat is a lot more insidious than you would think. Like, one of the topics I remember he covered, which I thought was almost like too clever, was, let's say you're some foreign actor, insert whatever nation. I don't want to alienate any of our viewers, but anyone that you don't think is friendly to the U.S.
North Korea.
Yeah, gets a version of ChatGPT, and they want to misuse it. What is some of the ways they would do it? In his example, they consume every element of your digital footprint, meaning every post you've ever made to Facebook, every tweet you've ever done, everything you've ever done that they can get their hands on, it consumes it. And that creates a knowledge base for you personally. Right. And then they, North Korea in our example, send you a very specific, tailored message, however they deliver that message to you. And that slightly influences or changes your view on things, right? Like maybe you're less a fan of capitalism or less of a fan of America, or it just a small tilt. That's all they want. because then they're going to do it at scale to everyone. And that's very powerful, right? Because I think, if North Korea sent out a massive SMS campaign that said, burn down the Capitol, I don't think everybody would be like, oh my gosh. Like, they wouldn't just immediately jump on it, right? Because they'd be like, oh, clearly, some enemy trying to do something. But that way I just described very insidious, like it knows enough about you, like how you think, how you believe, or what you believe in, and just slight modification, right? Like that's again, I think there's a real danger, and that's one way they could potentially influence an election is the example he was trying to make. Yeah. So I think it's real concern about, what is propaganda, where is it coming from? And I feel like another big concern, and this happened the last election, is when you say something's propaganda, so people don't trust it, and then it turns out to be valid, and then it's like, well, what's what? And then you don't have anything to believe, right? And I think that's a big concern, is that it's contributing to, what they call these false narratives, and then how are you validating them, right? Or what are you validating them against? And I think every tech company you can name out there has banned people for things that later turned out to be true, right? And then showed no remorse. None at all. So that's a big concern.
Yeah, you don't even have to name names. Everybody knows who these people are. So I appreciate the fact that he's maybe taking that, I guess, seriously, more seriously than I've seen maybe some of the others. You got Zuckerberg up there. Basically, I had no idea. I had no knowledge. It's like, sure you didn't. You took a lot of money for it, right?
I've always heard if you're using something and you don't pay any money for that product, then you're the product. That's I feel a very wise statement. Like, if you pay nothing for it and you're like, this product is free, you're the product. That's a very true statement.
Yeah. Keep that in mind. So how has, I guess, in your mind, his ideas and work and philosophy actually influenced future leaders in the world of tech, and specifically AI?
Yeah, well, I feel like just to break it apart, his recent example shows, like, how valuable it is to have a quality board, right? And I think it's funny, like, people were equating him to Steve Jobs, but if you remember, Jobs got kicked out. Most people forget that. He got thrown out. And then Apple, and then they were like, please come back. Now, Altman, a little different, because it happened in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show, again, I think firing your CEO is just like a big Band-Aid. Like, we don't like what's happening, or we don't like him, and we can just get rid of him. And then we're going to bring in someone new, right? And this someone new is going to create this amazing nirvana, right? And then, unfortunately, a lot of times it doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Well, CEOs have very unique characteristics, right? And they're not a dime a dozen, believe it or not. And they can have a really negative impact on your company. And you're taking a big risk when you do that, right? And I think one of the things it showed is that they had a lot of loyalty for him. And I think that's another thing, is like, CEOs should look at him and say, look, there's a lot of value and be connected with my base. How many people right now are listening to this podcast and are like, I don't even know who our CEO is. I know him by name, but I've never seen him. Or maybe I talked to him once for 2 minutes at a corporate event, but we don't really know each other, right? And then if you ask that same person, if he were to get thrown out by the board, would you sign a letter saying you were going to quit or go somewhere else? Most of them would be like, heck no, right? Like, no, right. I don't. And I've worked at a lot of firms where the CEO was like a revolving door. Like, I couldn't even keep up. How many times they switched him out. And again, I feel like that's a big mistake, right? I honestly think, you've got to weather the storm, right? And when there's issues, you got to move them out. But I also think one of the things, if you look at what happened to the board after that whole debacle, is they brought people in who were a different dynamic and also had a vested interest in the company. Now, sometimes you could say that's good to have a board that, isn't going to look at things just through a financial lens because they don't have a stake in the company. But other times I think it can definitely be bad and work against you. And if you look at, like, not to go too much down the rabbit hole, but you look at what happened to ERCOT after the whole Texas winter storm debacle, they made every single executive mandatory you lived in Texas, which I think that shows the relevance. Like, you have to have flipping skin in the game. You can't be pie in the sky, and I think that's another thing, is that he very much sent a message, to other companies, boards, executives that, look, you cannot be too far, I'll call it left, in terms of, oh, we're about, society and all these other nebulous concepts. I'm not going to say it's 100% wrong, but if you lose sight of all that, like that's going to be the destruction of your company, right? Because you're not keeping your eye on the ball, like why this company exists, what makes it successful. You're too much in the clouds, and I think that's definitely part of what contributed. And I think that's when you're looking at like how he's influenced future leaders, I think he's really shown that you've got to kind of have a balance there. And I feel like, and again, I feel like he's also shown a lot of value in working through these philanthropic organizations, using the money to help, start up new businesses, things like that, right? Because I feel like at the end of the day, some of that I would like to say, if I got into his position, that would be my goal, right? Is not just keep buying the next best sports car. Is like, hey, how can I lift up, these other people, because it's to the betterment of society, right? And he even said that some of the loyalty wasn't just because he was an amazing CEO. It's because the people recognized the value in what they had built, and they felt removing him from that was going to basically be like a house of cards. Like it was going to cause it to come apart. So it wasn't even just so much about him. It's the fact that once he was removed from that situation, that it was going to change the whole dynamic of that firm. And I believe it. I mean, I've seen people leave and new people come in at just a mid-level, not even CEO, and it totally changed the company, right?
Absolutely.
And it wasn't for the better, right? Like they took a totally different philosophy, like, no more time off and working 18 hours a day and I don't care about this, basically, like I'm all profit driven. Then everybody left, right? They're like, I don't need this, right? And then, yeah. So.
No, that's a good point. And I think there has to be something said about how a unique mind like Sam Altman's works and how a company like OpenAI would not have been innovating the way that it was without somebody like him at the top, right? And so for the board to, even if they maybe didn't have, they were having personality clashes, maybe he was pitting some of them together or against each other, the way they sneak attacked him was really interesting. And I think that it just didn't, sit well with the organization. And so even if you have to remove a leader, I think they went about it all wrong. I really do. And it just shows that the company probably wasn't going to survive without him. Right. And so that's why it was so important, like the Steve Jobs situation that you talked about before, you got to bring him back. And so now there's pie all over your face, right? You just look stupid at this point because you're
well, that's part of the reason I think. Part of it, they cleaned house on the board, but also part of it, they just didn't feel like they could go back to the same working relationship, right? Like, how would he go back into that room of, board members and be like, all right, all's forgiven. Like, you just can't do that, right? So, I mean, I get that. I mean, I think, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like, man, we could have podcasts to the end of time about bad decisions made by boards. I'm not saying they're the devil, but I definitely think that's a very important dynamic in a business is who comprises the board and how they look at the world and how they align with that CEO, right? Because, I mean, heck, one of the first companies I worked for, NetSolve, they had, this guy who, I mean, he started the company from nothing, grew it, became, relatively big, eventually got acquired by Cisco, but he had a board, and I remember talking to him straight up all the time where they would butt heads, and there was one time where the board went in a completely opposite direction, and he was like, forget y'all, and he went in opposite direction, and he was like, very much like I could have lost my house. Like all this stuff is on the line, but he also felt like this is my company and you're taking it in this crazy direction, like that I don't approve of. And it's tough. It's tough because like, I think you think it's not going to happen. Like, hey, like we're not always going to see eye to eye, but they're never going to completely go against what I want or my vision or how I feel. But it is, I mean, that story is as old as time where they, basically, and again, are they going in the wrong direction for the right reasons, or are they doing it because that's where the dollars are leading them, right? And that's where it gets tricky because, again, if you're a very affluent CEO, you become less about the dollars, less about the Benjamins, right? You're like, look, I want this to help society. And they're like, we want to make money. And then it's like divergence, right? So it can be problematic. and so that I'm sure that's why part of him was like, oh, I don't want these guys to have too much at stake in my company, so they're just coin operated. But then it's like he had the reverse problem, right? It's like he swung the pendulum too far the other way. And what I've heard now is that these people have a stake in the company, but they're not like, it's not like 30%. I mean, it's enough that they, they're going to feel some pain, but they're also not going to, it's not their livelihood, which I think that's probably a good balance, or a good way I would look at it.
Anytime there's that amount of money and opportunity involved, you're going to have players that are there for different reasons. And, I think even the more money I make, to be honest with you, Steve, the less I'm motivated by it. And I'm more motivated by, like you said, philanthropic things that I know will last beyond my time here on this earth, right? And I can appreciate, I don't know where Sam Altman is from a faith standpoint, but I can appreciate the fact that he really has shown that he's willing to invest his time and money and resources into things that go beyond just building OpenAI, right? And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you maybe admire most about Sam? And on the controversial side, like, what are maybe some of the things that you would challenge him with if you were given the chance?
Well, I want to say in general how he's trying to be responsible about this thing he's birthed into the planet. Now, again, some people could say, well, he doesn't really have a choice. He's being forced. I mean, heck, he had to testify before Congress, that kind of deal. But
right.
I think that's important that he's making that a priority. And I think, he easily maybe could have made more money going to Microsoft, for example, right? So I think it's fair to say that he wants to really take OpenAI, and his whole big thing is scaling. He wants to scale everything, but he wants to scale it for the betterment. Like, he wants to, one of the things I heard him say, which I thought was interesting, he says the cost and quality of intelligence is drastically changing. So that's kind of how he views it. Even just removing AI for a moment, like how much you have to pay to get good intelligence and the quality of that intelligence. Like, if you can, go in those opposite directions, that's a good thing. That's a real good thing. Now, how do you achieve that safely, though, right? Because like anything else, you're going to have good and bad, right? But I think the fact that he's making that such a big priority, and also another thing I admire about him is how much he said with confidence that his executives, like if he just disappeared tomorrow, could successfully run that company, right? And I think that's another thing that I admire about him, and all other leaders can learn from him, is that your generals, that executive staff, that's very important, right? Because I think some people, it's like they have executives just because they have to have executives, but really the buck stops with them. They're almost like they run the company like a dictator, versus I think, putting really good people around you. I'm sure preaching to the choir here with your HR spin there, but I think that's a huge part of it, right? Like, your company is only as good as its people. And for him to say, look, I want to invest in them. I want to make sure we have quality people in place. And then therefore I'm not essential. Like, this machine will keep running whether I'm here or not. Now, you don't want to make it, I guess, too much where you're completely obsolete, but that's a very, I admire that approach. Even when I ran my own business, that was kind of one of my aspirations. Like, I didn't want to be so central to it that if I took a day off, everything just fell apart. Because to me, that's a bad mark on you as a leader, is that you basically made yourself so essential that if the moment you leave, everything falls apart because you've never trained anyone, you've never trusted them, and you've never put the right people in place, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's something I admire about him. Now, what is on the flip side of that? What do I think he could change or do differently? I feel like there should be more of a trade-off between open and closed source, so to speak. Because right now I definitely feel like some of the feedback that Elon's said about the company, because they've definitely had a love-hate relationship, is true. He basically says OpenAI isn't open and it's a profit-driven machine, right? No. Is it true? Well, he admits that they want him to make a lot of money because they have to spend, one of the computers he talked about, supercomputers, was $10 billion. So I get it. Hey, man, you got to make a profit if you're going to build a $10 billion computer. But at the same time, I think, all the reasons I've heard as to why it's closed source is the reason every code is closed source. Not every code, but all the people that have closed source code, that's why they do it. Is they don't want people to steal it. They don't want people to abuse it. They don't want to blah, 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 blah. But I think we've learned, Linux is like the ultimate example. We've learned that yes, horrible things can happen, and have people taken Linux open source and done bad things with it? Sure. But have good things happen from it? Heck yeah. I mean, we got 20 years of good things coming out of Linux because of the fact it was open source. And they had that same debate, and back in the 80s when that thing came out. Like, what's going to happen? Oh, it's open source. The end of the world as we know it. You know, and, you know, I'm not going to say it was perfect, but yeah, people took that and they made it better, that inspires me, the fact that there are people that, you know, were making Linux better. There still are, that aren't doing it for the money. They want Linux to be better. They want it to work better. And if you think about, I don't know, how many people in the world know code and can make ChatGPT better? I mean, millions. We're talking millions. Now, how can they do it responsibly and safely? I mean, that's something they got to figure out. But I feel like you got to do more of that, right? Because I think ultimately, if he's all about scaling, he's got to enable, you know, these users. I mean, literally, he's got a potential of millions of employees willing to help him. And he's got the name, right? I mean, you know, these people, they could contribute to other AI projects, and they are. I mean, heck, you just look up all the other ones that actually are open source AI right now. There's a ton of them. And they're gaining traction. Why? Because they're actually open source. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even saying he has to make the models open source, because that's definitely more there. That's where the real product is. But just even the UIs, you know, and letting people to, you know, kind of give it back. I mean, Wikipedia technically is open source, but they still have a way. Like if, I don't know, I bring up a Wikipedia page on George Washington and say, oh, you know what, he was actually born in 1950, and I submit it or change it. They have a way to kind of and be like, hey, you know, I don't really think he's right here. Like, I can't just go to Wikipedia and just jack up history. Like, I can try, but they have a way to safeguard it. And I think that's the same concept. Is like, hey, look, if people start putting in bad code or doing things you don't like, you know, it's not like they lost the version, you know. So I mean, that's the piece. If I was going to give feedback negative, is more of that, and we'll find a better balance to how to make it open source.
Well, just to touch on your Wikipedia example, Wikipedia is always asking for money. It looks like they're about to go bankrupt. Because
every time I log in, they're going bankrupt. They're like that guy on the street corner. I only need $5 more to get on the bus, and you're like, dude, you've been trying to get on this bus for 10 years. Like, what? A bus rate's just going up. Like, what's happening here? Where's this money going?
Right. Yeah. But so you need a working model that you know can pay the bills, and you know, so you can continue to provide your services, and not-for-profits struggle with that, right? Because they're completely beholden to, you know, whatever donors that they have, and you know that there's some ebb and flow to that, just like there is for, you know, profitable organizations. But so I think this is an interesting topic. You know, obviously, Stephen, hopefully we did it some justice talking about Altman, but he's an interesting person. I don't think even in one episode you could talk about all the dynamics that would be important to him, but he's interesting to explore because of not only what he's created, but kind of the persona that is Sam Altman. So I appreciate you jumping on here, you know, doing this. It's obviously a delight to navigate this and many other intriguing, you know, topics with you, Stephen. It's always, you know, fun because you have a unique and infectious sense of humor, which is always making me laugh. So I want to thank the listeners for always plugging in and listening. You know, I'm curious what your perspective is on Sam. If there was anything that you wanted us to cover that we should have, make sure you put it in the comments below. Make sure you boop the like button if you like topics like this. If we should cover some other ones that you're interested in, you're like, hey, I'd like to hear about, you know, such and such or such and such. Make sure you share those with us, because we'll dive in deep to those and try to do our best to kind of cover all these fascinating people and topics around technology. And so I hope you will stay subscribed and listen into future episodes of What the Tech. Thank you.